Okay, hello, and thank you for joining me for the second episode of Ukrainian. Thank you to everybody who watched the first episode. I really appreciate it. Today we had a bit of a crisis at home because my darling child came home from summer camp, and this is he. He was asking me all kinds of questions about this, the Ukrainian language and the letters, and isn't it just the same thing as Russian, and what's the big difference, and isn't Ukraine just a very new state? Weren't they formed in like 1998, Mom? And so Grayson had the pleasure of sitting with me for hours today to kind of correct some of that. One of the first things I asked him when he said, Ukraine is a new baby state, my first question is, and what does that matter? My second question was, and in what context? The arguments can be made that Ukraine was its own sovereign state thousands of years ago, and then throughout history we can trace it, and it's definitely not a straight line, but it also doesn't start in 1991. So I wanted to disabuse some of that notion right quickly. I think he regrets these comments. To that end, and in order to make sure I don't talk for 45 minutes today, I made an agenda. Okay, so the first thing is that I think it would be helpful if we all were on the same page as to what is a state, what is sovereignty, what defines a sovereign state, and then finally, what kind of cocaine does Mr. Putin snort when he explains the difference between the Russian and Ukrainian languages. I did spend an awful lot of time reading his, what is this thing called? The Friendship Bracelet essay, article by Vladimir Putin on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. It is quite a read, lots of fun facts to check, lots of things to talk about, so I wanted to hopefully stick to that agenda so that the show can be purposeful and have an end. Okay, so the first question I wanted to talk about is kind of what, you hear the term nation state, what does it mean? What does it mean? And I think that it's important to make the distinction between a nation state and a sovereign nation state, or a sovereign state, for so that we can all be on the same page on this dialogue as to where Ukraine is. Okay, so a nation state is a system of organizations defined by geography, politics, and culture. Cultural identity that is shared by the people and the state usually has a shared language, shared national identity. It must have physical borders. Good examples of nation states are France, Egypt, Germany, and Japan. Very homogeneous populations, one language. That's very much how you define a nation state. So what on earth is sovereignty, right? I can tell you it is a Monty Python skit about the Treaty of Westphalia. That does nothing to illuminate the concept whatsoever. I watched it a lot of times today just because it was funny. But back in 1648, they decided that, in the midst of these crazy religious ideas between Protestantism and Catholicism and Calvinism, that states could determine what religions they would allow within their borders. And that's kind of the first iteration of sovereignty. The more modern definition would be it's when when the monopoly on the legitimate use of force within a territory exists, that makes a sovereign state. So examples of non-sovereign actors would be murderers, those who are committing war crimes or genocide, those are all illegitimate actions. That's illegitimate use of force within a territory. But your government can delegate that power to, say, a local police force. But the authority for the police force to use any of that force actually originates from the state's permission. Things can get very complicated because if you have a monarchy, the divine right of kings, they are the sovereign is the queen, blah, blah, blah. Here in the U.S., good Lord, we have presidents, we have Congress, we have the Supreme Court, we have Beyonce. We got a lot of people who have a lot of say in what goes on here and what's allowed, permissible, etc. But we are a sovereign country, and as I pointed out to my darling son, we are a young country, and we had no shared history, and we had no distinct language, and we had no distinct culture. And now, look at us. We are the laughingstock of most of the planet, and, for good reason, and it's American culture is, I guess, funny, or tragic, depending on how you view Kentucky Fried Chicken. I don't know. But we are a sovereign country. So now the question becomes, is Ukraine... clearly Putin does not view it as a nation state or a sovereign state. He considers it part of Russia. So I was intrigued. I was like, where did he get this from? Because that makes no sense, right? So let's take a look. So first, I to anyone who did not read the Q&A in the New Yorker, where it's entitled Vladimir Putin's Revisionist History of Russia and Ukraine. It's an excellent Q&A, and it kind of goes through a lot of the things that he takes issue with. I think it's interesting. He blames both the former Soviet Union and the West for creating a Ukraine problem, because without basically everybody but him and Russia created a problem where Ukrainians got crazy ideas in their heads about wanting independence and freedom. And it's everyone else's fault, and that's why they have to come in and kill all of our children. Okay. So one of the things he repeats is that Ukraine is kind of a man-made, manufactured nationality. It doesn't actually exist. It was the Bolsheviks kind of pushing these peasant people to feel like they had their own identity so that they wouldn't turn anti-Russian. I don't know a lot about peasants, but I don't think that you tell them, make up some new 100-year-old dances and some new 1,000-year-old costumes and celebrate some different holidays with a different language, and I'm going to give that to you so that you are too busy doing your own little, rain dance over on the steps, and you're not gonna complain about what's going on in Moscow, right? To me, that seems like a very dumb plan, if that's what they thought, and to the extent that worked, more power to you. I don't quite see that as how Ukrainians would interpret their history, or even what happened when it was kind of pushed into the USSR. So to answer my son's question about how far back you can trace a Ukrainian identity, like I said, it really depends on the element of the identity that you're looking at. The New Yorker article here says if you're talking about language, that would be primordial. Religious components more than 1,000 years old. But the first modern Ukrainian political project started in the mid-19th century. And then they go on and on, because throughout World War I, World War II, I guess, various pieces of Poland and Hungary and Austria all laid claim to pieces of Ukraine. Russia, same thing. So it was definitely a country being ripped apart by people all across its borders. He says that Putin writes, the Soviet Union was created in 1922 to 1923 as a pseudo-federal rather than a unitary state, precisely in order to accommodate Ukraine and Georgia, the two most independent-minded republics. The Bolsheviks took control of most of the Russian Empire by recognizing, at least pro forma, the independence of the different republics they were including. Ukraine was a briefly independent country or state. When the Bolsheviks signed a 1922 agreement with Germany, questions emerged from Ukrainians as to why representatives of the Russian Federation had any rights to sign the agreements for them. Again, the right to engage in treaties is a right that solely belongs to the sovereign. So, good question, Ukrainians. Stalin apparently wasn't terribly interested in that. Lenin apparently sided with the Ukrainians and the Georgians. He thought that they should have their own, let them have their language, let them do their dances, let them have their costumes. We don't care, because at the end of the day, we're all the proletariat and we're all working for the same thing, and we're going to have a communist utopia, so rock on. That ended up, Lenin died and Stalin kind of put an end to that, and he ended up starving. I think the total is between 3 and 5 million Ukrainians, which Canada, the United States, Ukraine all recognize as a genocide. So that was the Ukraine famine of 1932 to 1933. And it wasn't just stealing the grain. He took away their Ukrainian language. In a decree, he ended support for teaching Ukrainian language, and he stopped any education or publication of Ukrainian outside of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And there were stricter controls on cultural activities, and they did all of this to deal with the potential rise of Ukrainian nationalism. Again, you don't put nationalism in a bottle. It is always going to it's going to burst. So just trying to tamp this down was not a good move. So moving ahead to the end of the Soviet Union, 60 years later, we have an independent Ukraine. So how do you look back on what happened in 1991 and those first few years of Ukrainian independence? He says, by 91, the idea of a nation and its connection to language and culture had changed. The Ukrainians were now imagined more as a civic nation in the making. The big industrial cities were speaking Russian, and support for independence was more than 90% in December of 91. Ethnicity mattered and language mattered, but they were secondary. The majority for every region was for independence. Who does that sound like? It sounds a lot like America, right? Sounds a lot like anyone who's ever been colonized and ever sought to be free from any kind of imperial reign. I'm looking at you, India, Philippines. Happy birthday, by the way. All Canada, all of us. Freedom matters. It's more than a language. So the next question, in what ways do language divisions manifest themselves among the population? Historically, Ukrainian was the language of the countryside. There was a group of people quite large that viewed Ukrainian as their mother tongue and had a Ukrainian identity, despite the fact that they spoke Russian. And I guess in response to the annexation of Crimea, Ukrainians made a conscious effort to stop with the Russian speaking and to start speaking Ukrainian. And that's been the trend since then. So with that, I wanted to go to his actual writing here. He is a very boring writer. I really don't care for his stuff. But here it is, article by Vladimir Putin on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, written last year. Okay. And this is funny. First of all, I would like to emphasize that the wall that has emerged in recent years between Russia and Ukraine, between the parts of what is essentially the same historical and spiritual space, to my mind, is our great common misfortune and tragedy. These are first and foremost the consequences of our own mistakes made at different periods of time, i.e. USSR, but these are also the result of the deliberate efforts by those forces that have always sought to undermine our unity, i.e. the West. Freedom! Right. So, the whole free world and the former Soviet world were all against Russia and Ukraine getting hitched. Okay. So, he then says, it is impossible to cover in this article all of the developments that have taken place over more than 1,000 years, but I will focus on key pivotal moments that are important for us to remember. I can't wait for you to hear what these are. Ready? Okay. He says, after going through kind of things about clans and various, times when Lithuania owned such and such, Oleg the Prophet of Kiev, ancient Rus, he loves that one. Again, I don't get how Belarus fits into his little scheme, and why I don't get where and why they fall in line. But he concludes with, most importantly, people both in the western and eastern Russian lands spoke the same language. Their faith was Orthodox, and the unified church government remained in place. So I would like to take this opportunity to explain the difference between Ukrainian language and the Russian language. It is significant, and I want, and this is, I apologize, it's geared towards English speakers, but it does help make a point, so bear with me if you can. So Putin claims that, basically Ukrainian is a dialect of Russian, and that they're essentially the same. Now, a lot of people who grew up in the Soviet Union had to learn Russian, so a lot of people speak Russian. Does not make Ukrainian any closer in terms of relation to the Russian language. So they share more vocabulary, grammar, and features of pronunciation with each other than they do with other Slavic languages. They both use the Cyrillic alphabet, but slightly different versions. There are 4 letters in Ukrainian missing from Russian. I can draw those out for you. I don't even know how to say them. And 4 letters in Russian missing from Ukrainian. So a total of 8 letters different, right? That to me is already pretty significant. One frequently cited figure is that Ukrainian and Russian share about 62% of their vocabulary. That sounds like a lot, right? Guess what? Guess who else shares 62% of their vocabulary? I'm going to play you something, and I am hoping that it demonstrates my point. Who knows? It probably won't, because, again, not the greatest lawyer. Here we go. Okay. The volume. Shit. Hold on 1 second. Bear with me.
YouTube kunsten.
Here we go. Da, 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 da.
Goedenavond. Ik hoop dat je genoten hebt van het mooie weer vandaag en dat je meer bedreven bent in de YouTube-kunsten.
Okay, English speakers, what did my phone just say to you? What was it saying? Because that language, i.e. Dutch, is as closely related to English as Russian is to Ukrainian.
Good evening. I hope you enjoy the beautiful weather today and that you are more skilled in the YouTube arts.
That's right. So, basically, it's like, it would be like waking up and reading a Dutch newspaper. I've tried it. It's impossible for me. I basically can't use street signs there. I almost can't find my way out of the airport. And yet, Putin would have you believe that Ukrainian and Russian are indistinguishable. I think that it's when he talks about how they emerge from the same ancestor language, he's making the point that it's easier for a Russian to learn Ukrainian than it is for an English speaker. Yes, guess what? Because we have our own set of crazy stuff going on in this Proto-Germanic language, which I guess, if all of the Germanic languages, and there are a lot of them, it's English, German. Excuse me. Sorry about that. But it's Dutch, Swedish, Icelandic, Norwegian. The list goes on and on of languages that are from this mother German proto language. I'm sorry, I forget what they called it. So, yes, they may have come from the same, ancient mother language, but it doesn't make them dialects. It's not tomato. It is it's not ZZ. It's Dutch versus English. So to me, that's fairly significant, and it was a point I made sure my son understood. And now he's going to sit with me and do Ukrainian lessons after his summer camp. So that's going to be a good time. So again, I found a bunch of articles that kind of go through point by point to refute some of the arguments that Putin has made, and to give some of these journalists credit, they do give him, if he has a bone, they let him have it, and they say he has a point. He's not totally wrong, or he's 25% right, however you want to describe that. So let me get to my next little tabs. Okay, yes, this is nice. He says, the name Ukraine was used more often in the meaning of the old Russian word Okrena, periphery, which is found in written sources from the 21st century, referring to various border territories. And the word Ukrainian, judging from archival documents, originally referred to frontier guards who protected external borders. So he has now called our people peripheral, and former guards that stood outside Russia to defend it. I'm at a loss. Okay. Here's some fun ones. In summer 1945, the historical act of the reunification of Carpathian Ukraine with its ancient motherland Ukraine, as the Pravda newspaper put it, was announced. Therefore, modern Ukraine is entirely the product of the Soviet era. We know and remember well that it was shaped for a significant part on the lands of historical Russia. Do we know that? I mean, there's going to be another show. I have map after map after map, not to mention the treaty he signed in 2004, or he absolutely could have brought all of these points up and redrawn some lines. But but he still feels like that Russian land was taken and given to Ukraine. He says that the Bolsheviks treated the Russian people as inexhaustible material for their social experiments. It is no longer important what exactly the idea of the Bolshevik leaders who were chopping the country into pieces was. We can disagree about minor details, background, and logic behind certain decisions. One fact is crystal clear. Russia was robbed. Indeed. So I clerked for the oldest federal judge in the world, and he taught me one really cool thing. He said, anytime you see anything in a brief that says, it is crystal clear, absolutely clear, undeniably clear, whatever follows is gobbledygook horseshit, because it is anything but clear. That would be the case here, Senor Putin. I like he talks about working on this article. He used open source documents and not secret ones. Like, touche. Here we go. He then says, you want to establish a state of your own? You are welcome. But what are the terms? I will recall the assessment given by one of the most prominent political figures of New Russia, first mayor of St. Petersburg, Anatoly Sobchak. This is the dude who was so corrupt and so awful that when he had a heart attack, I think the entire town threatened the doctors not to perform heart surgery on him, and he had to be taken abroad to get the surgery because everyone hated him for being a corrupt asshole. So, good guy to quote. Here he is as a legal expert. As a legal expert who believed that every decision must be legitimate, in 1992 he shared the following opinion. The republics that were founders of the Union, having denounced the 1922 Union Treaty, must return to the boundaries they had before joining the Soviet Union. All other territorial acquisitions are subject to discussion, negotiations, given that the ground has been revoked. In other words, when you leave, take what you brought with you. And then he says that logic is hard to refute. Okay. When we have map day, we see exactly what happened, like how the Soviet Union formed and where the boundary lines were drawn. We'll see how fun what great wisdom that is. So I guess he also says, even after the events in Kiev of 2014, he charged the Russian government to elaborate options for preserving and maintaining our economic ties. He's saying that, so basically in November 2013, the Ukrainian parliament very much wanted to align itself with the EU and wanted to enter into some fair trade agreements. And then President Yanukovych ignored his parliament, said going with Mother Russia, and people didn't like that. So there were some protests and 108 people died. I like how he calls it events in Kiev. Okay. He says, in essence, Ukraine's ruling circles decided to justify their country's independence through the denial of the past. However, except for border issues. They began to mythologize and rewrite history, edit out everything that united us. Do you think that's what's going on? And I really mean this, and I'm curious, and if there's anyone in Ukraine who could explain this to me, because again, in speaking with my Russian friend, it's, she said that the border is more fluid and that families have family members on both sides. And yes, there's a huge disconnected information and belief of what's going on. But, is this mythologizing and rewriting history? And again, I would even ask the question, if it were, would it even be necessary? Because sovereign states are born and emerge, and they can do so right now with no history, no language, no religion, a common belief about the purpose of government and how that power should be wielded. And that's what it takes. And I believe that's what President Zelensky is trying to do. I believe that's what his government wanted to do. And now they are stuck with this shitty invasion and genocide. And they're, trying desperately to defend themselves. And again, I have no words. Crimea presents kind of different issues. He says here, the people of Crimea and the residents of, I'm sorry, I can't pronounce this, made their historic choice. The people in the southeast peacefully tried to defend their stance, yet all of them, including children, were labeled as separatists and terrorists. They were threatened with ethnic cleansing and the use of military force. The residents of Donetsk and Luhansk took up arms to defend their homes, their language, and their lives. Were they left any other choice after the riots that swept through the cities of Ukraine, after the horror and tragedy of May 2nd, 2014 in Odessa, where Ukrainian neo-Nazis burned people alive, making a new Katyn out of it? The same massacre was ready to be carried out by the followers of Bandera in Crimea, Sevastopol, Donetsk, Luhansk. Even now, they do not abandon such plans. If any of that, if there's evidence of any of that, I mean, I haven't seen it. I don't understand Russian state television. I don't know if people think they're seeing that happening. I find it very troubling how easily he's kind of taking the moniker of Hitler and applying it to a group of people that he's slaughtering. And again, this whole defense of ethnic Russians and defense of their language. Like I had a pro bono client, an ethnic Russian living in Latvia, and the worst she could come up with was getting called names on a bus. So it's just such a disproportionate response, but that is the way of Putin, so I guess that does make sense. This is also my favorite. Again, for many people in Ukraine, the anti-Russia project is simply unacceptable, and there are millions of such people, but they are not allowed to raise their heads. 1 second. Sorry, folks. Okay. They are not allowed to raise their heads. They have had their legal opportunity to defend their point of view, in fact, taken away from them. They are intimidated, driven underground. Not only are they persecuted for their convictions, for the spoken word, for the open expression of their position, but they are also killed. See that? Am I holding this up clearly enough? Probably not. Hold on. Mr. Putin, you wrote about this phenomenon. You wrote about this and said that people in Ukraine were suffering this man's fate. How do you not see the injustice and inconsistency? How could anyone not want to be independent from an empire that would treat this man so horribly for simply asking, do you still need this war? A 60-year-old man. Do you still need this war? 7 years in prison. And then for you to say that in Ukraine they're being killed for their convictions about Russia and Russian ethnicity. So that brings me to my last point of the day, which is about Ukrainian culture. And I think it's funny because in speaking to my Russian friend the other day, I said, I think it's, I wish Russian people understood how much we appreciate Russian culture and Russian people. And she made the point her husband is very popular whenever they go to Moscow, and I don't doubt it. He's a Texan. He's funny. It's hard to hate Texans, right, my dear? But we studied Tolstoy, and we study, we dance to Tchaikovsky every December, and we listen to Rachmaninoff, and we read Nabokov, and I was in Chekhov's The Seagull in college. I was Masha. I could even perform for her my first line, which was, "Why are you always wearing black? I'm in mourning for my life. I'm unhappy." Scene. I was also in Nikolai Gogol's play, The Government Inspector. Boop, boop, Ukrainian. And that whole play had a whole different feel than The Seagull. Whole different feel. What I loved was that it was I think Nikolai Gogol, as an artist and an author, kind of took everything about his experience growing up as on the countryside in Ukraine as a peasant, and made a hilarious play about a kind of douchey guy coming from Russia to inspect the town, and how they kind of got confused and got the wrong guy. But I had a lot of pride for being in a Ukrainian. I love Chekhov. I love The Seagull. I felt immense pride in being in Nikolai Gogol's play. And I've been trying to listen to more Ukrainian folk music, which is unbelievably beautiful, and learning more about the Ukrainian poets and nationalists, and there is absolutely more than just a thread. There's thick ribbons that bind Ukrainians. And on another episode, I'm going to go through what happened at International Night when me and my Ukrainian sister across the street, we ran the Ukrainian table and kicked International Night's ass by having the most popular table of all, because we had everybody decorate Ukrainian Easter eggs, which brought up a whole conversation about being Orthodox Ukrainian or Jewish or Muslim, because you can be any of those things in Ukraine. I know that when my parents tried to get me baptized in the Catholic Church, the priest said, my last name, Ukrainian, should be in the Ukrainian church. So that will be fun, and that will be something to discuss. Oh, and tomorrow I realized I spoke way too quickly about one of my favorite topics, which is unfreezing and using the $300 billion of frozen assets belonging to the Russian central bank that we have, and we took away their magical SWIFT power, so they can't transfer anything, they can't move any money around, and I know that they're pissed because they're like, if you use it, we're going to go after Alaska. So I cannot wait to have a discussion about kind of the difference between the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the Patriot Act. A lot of people are like, oh, it'll take an act of Congress. I'd like everyone to take a look at Mitch McConnell's Supreme Court, and I want someone to bring a lawsuit, because I don't think that bench is going to do anything but unfreeze Russian assets, probably to they may be making gold toilets in their homes. I don't know what they would do with it, but sure won't be going back to Russia. So some thoughts on that tomorrow. So again, I am very grateful for getting to spend this time with anyone listening, and as always, Slava Ukraini, glory to Ukraine, glory to our heroes, and please, I hope everyone there is safe and stays safe, and that everyone here in the U.S. or anywhere else in the free world where we have the privilege to sit back and help in very uncourageous ways, like myself, I hope we can at least all do what we can. Okay, good night.